All right, so at the end of week 2, it was another really, really exciting week. Obviously, there was a couple of games that were absolute shockers. One game that we'll get into a little bit later, but really good matchups so far this week. But we're going to start out with our losers, and I think our first loser of the week has to be Kirk Cousins, going back to that Monday night game against the Eagles. Kirk Cousins has never been good in primetime games and primetime situations. And last night against the Philadelphia Eagles was no different. This was a game that I was expecting a little bit more from the Vikings, obviously, because when they faced off against the Packers, they could not do anything wrong. Kirk Cousins the week before threw 2 passing touchdowns, 277 yards, 23 for 32 completion. And you know what? He was only sacked once. This week, very different story. He threw the ball 46 times, only completed 27 passes, 221 yards, 1 touchdown to 3 bad interceptions. And honestly, he could have had closer to 5 interceptions if Darius Slay didn't have the night that he was having. It was a bad night all around for Kirk Cousins. He didn't look good.
Yeah, this is why I tried to sway your vote on Saturday when we were making our predictions and you were initially thinking of picking the Vikings. And I had to remind you, Kirk Cousins in primetime is not a desirable option. He is very bad. I didn't even bother watching this game last night because I knew it's the Vikings, it's Kirk Cousins in primetime. He always plays horribly. It's not entertaining to watch him. Unless he's playing against your team, then it's fun to watch him throw a bunch of picks to your defense.
But Sterling, give us our second loser of the week.
Our second loser of the week this week was another game that we expected both these teams to have bounce back games. It was one of the 2:00 games, I believe. It was the Raiders and the Cardinals, and the Raiders had hold of this game all week, or all game, and then they completely collapsed at the end. And so the Raiders are our second loser this week because, they had no right losing that game. They were dominating all the way. Cardinals were playing a decent game. It was by no stretch a blowout. But then you let them come down and you let Kyler Murray run in for a touchdown with no time left, and then throw a 2-point conversion to tie it up and send it to overtime. Just insane to me.
Yeah, well, going into halftime, the Raiders were up 20-0,
Mm-hmm.
and going into the fourth quarter, it was 23-7, and like throughout that entire game, the Raiders had looked pretty good.
Yeah.
Like Max Crosby, he was doing his thing. He was getting after Kyler Murray. Like the Raiders team looked good. Their offense could have been a little bit better. They weren't moving the ball consistently, but once they got to that fourth quarter and Kyler Murray just basically said, "You know what? I'm going to do it all myself."
Yep. Yeah,
Then
he pushed it into another gear and he just went off.
Well, the big thing with the Cardinals in that fourth quarter, they needed 2 touchdowns with both 2-point conversions completed. They get both of that, and then they get into overtime, and they at that point, I think everyone knew that the Cardinals were going to win that game solely because the Raiders had no momentum, and you feel really, really bad for Derek Carr because it's such a tough, devastating loss, and we expected the Raiders not to be 0-2. We looked at them being like, okay, they lose to the Chargers at week 1. They played a competitive game there, and they go out, face off against the Cardinals, and end up 1-1 at the end of week 2. But now that they're 0-2, suddenly this division that we've been talking about just being an absolute powerhouse where we could see all 4 teams potentially try to make a playoff push, it's now suddenly starting to look more and more just like it's a 2-team race, and then there's 2 teams that don't look like they can compete. Yeah, so heading into our final game or our final loser of the week, and the fact that we're talking about this team right now kind of actually shocks me a little bit because it is the Cincinnati Bengals. Going into this year, if you were to tell me the Cincinnati Bengals would be 0-2, I would have looked at you and said, Joe Burrow must have been hurt. He must have got hurt the first play of game 1, and he wasn't able to play this game. both you and I said during the weekend on our podcast that we were choosing the Bengals to win pretty hands down because they had something to prove. Dak Prescott wasn't in the game, and we didn't really feel like the Cowboys were going to be able to do that. They weren't able to get anything done. And Joe Burrow, the week before, got sacked, what was it, 7 times by your Steelers defense? He
Yep.
got sacked 6 times by the
Yep.
Cowboys this time. Granted, I guess that's better than 6, but you know what? When he's sitting at 13 sacks in 2 games, you looked at the Bengals and said they should have they improved their offensive line this offseason, and it doesn't seem like that at
Well,
all.
it feels like that's all we talked about when it came to the Bengals during the preseason was how much money they spent on improving their offensive line, how much effort they put into improving that offensive line and keeping Joe Burrow protected. And they have not protected him at all through these first 2 games. I'm surprised he hasn't gotten hurt yet, really. And I mean, against a Cowboys team without Dak Prescott, who they couldn't even score more than 3 points against the Bucks. And they came out and they end up beating the Bengals. And that's 2 weeks in a row now that the Bengals have lost on clutch field goals, which does not bode well for them if they manage to turn this around and get to the playoffs. Those are the moments you need to be having control of the ball and control of the game. Like if you can't win it in the final minutes, then you're not going to win a Super Bowl.
Yeah, so moving over to our winners, because there was a lot of really really good games this week, and there was a lot of players. You and I debated on probably 7 or 8 different guys that we could possibly have on this list, and we could throw out some honorable mentions. We're actually going to be making a video on one of the guys that is not featured on this list later down the road. But the first winner for this week, I think it has to be the New York Giants. Obviously week 1, we gave them props for being, they were a winner for us in week 1 because they went out and beat the Tennessee Titans, who were last year's #1 seed in the AFC, and they had a healthy Derrick Henry, and we still expected them to be a good team. But then the Giants beat them, but then they go out this week, and we looked at the Panthers and went, they probably should win this game because they looked like a better team. And Daniel Jones is still the Giants quarterback. And to me, it was so shocking. Well, then again, that game was pretty much solely down to just field goals. It's not really like Daniel Jones or Baker Mayfield really outdueled each other throughout that, because looking at Baker Mayfield, he completed 14 out of 29 for 145 yards, 1 touchdown, no interceptions. Daniel Jones wasn't a whole lot better with 22 out of 34, 176 and 1 touchdown, no interceptions. So like they're very comparable in that area. So it was a really sloppy kind of game, mostly set down to just field goals. Like there was 2 field goals, or there was 4 field goals just in the first half alone. And then you get to the final, there was an additional 3 field goals just in the fourth quarter. So, but the fact that the Giants are still managing to win these close games, gotta enjoy it. Gotta like it.
Well, this is, big props to the coaching staff in New York right now, because that's the big change that's really happened this season. And we saw it last week. They did it on the ground. Saquonbarkley sort of took the team on his back and won that game for them. This week we saw it was much more the coaching and the special teams, and it was Daniel Jones at the end of the game getting the passing touchdown that ultimately ended up winning the game for them. And so we've seen them win different ways, and we've seen them be successful in all areas of the ball, which is important for a team going forward, especially in a division that, the Cowboys somehow pulled out a win. We assumed they were going to be like 0-6 by the time Dak Prescott came back. Now that division, all these teams are sitting right in around that 1 win, 2 win, like they're all very close, and so the Giants have to keep pace with whichever team is going to step into that Dallas Cowboys role and try and win that division. And right now they've kind of got the reins on that division.
So moving over to our next team, and this is kind of like the other side of that. Obviously, you're kind of going more towards the Giants end of things, But I'm going to actually look at the guy who's up next on our winners list, and that's Jalenhurts of the Philadelphia Eagles. The dude was absolutely dynamite this week. He was an honorable mention for us in week 1. We didn't have him on the list, but he played really, really well. And now we see him in week 2, and we were expecting this to be a much tougher matchup because obviously we saw the Vikings struggle, or the Packers struggle against the Vikings defense. Jalen Hurts came out there and was absolutely dynamite. 330 passing yards. Then you add another 57 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns on the ground. He did throw only 1 touchdown and he did throw an interception, but like the dude, he controlled that entire game. Anything that Jalen Hurts did, it worked. With the exception of like 1 pass, and that being the interception, it was an entire Jalen Hurts game. And I think the Philadelphia Eagles right now, they are controlling that NFC East solely because they have, I think, probably the best built team and arguably the best quarterback in that division.
Yeah, I gotta agree with you. Like the Eagles are much more well rounded, and Jalen Hurts. Well, I mean, both of these quarterbacks, Jalen Hurts and Daniel Jones, both have something to prove. They're both sort of in that contract year. They're both trying to get paid, But Jalen Hurts definitely has way more weapons around him. We discussed it last week. The reason we sort of left the Eagles off was their defense was really lacking. This week, they stepped up against the Vikings. Again, easy to do against Kirk Cousins in prime time, but they sort of showed those flashes of dominance that they're going to need going forward to win this division and be successful in the playoffs. But yeah, I mean, I can't wait to see these two teams play each other because it's going to be a really good coaching battle.
So going to our final winner of this week, we have the Detroit Lions. And I never thought I would say the biggest winner of the week would be the Detroit Lions as a whole team. But they, man, like to go out against the Philadelphia Eagles week 1 and play that close of a game and play that good of a game, but just falling a little bit short. I kind of looked at that when, Washington, they had a big win in week 1. They should be able to beat the Detroit Lions. The Detroit Lions, the entire team itself, like Jared Goff threw 4 touchdowns, no interceptions. St. Brown, he got a couple of really good, like he was rushing. He led the team in rushing, and then he led the team in rushing for 68 yards off of 2 carries. And then in the receiving game, he had 9 receptions for 116 yards and 2 touchdowns. The dude was absolutely dynamite. And then you go over to the defensive side of things, and Aiden Hutchinson had 5 solo tackles, 6 total tackles, 3 sacks, and 2 tackles for loss. Like the second overall pick, the dude, like, what more can you say, man? Like, that is elite numbers. But the Detroit Lions, just the entirety of that game, were just so good, man.
They were, and we said this when we were making our picks on Saturday. Neither of us picked the Detroit Lions because we both said, like, show us. Like every season, they're a little bit better, but they can never seem to get the wins, especially early in the year. And we couldn't really put our faith in making them a pick. And they came out this week and they did. And Amon-Ra St. Brown, he's been the guy that they've been waiting for him to take off. They've compared him to guys like Deebo Samuel and said that he's their dynamic playmaker, that he can be used out of the backfield, he can be used in the slot, he can be used wide out, and you get the ball in his hands and he makes things happen. And that is what the Detroit Lions have been looking for ever since Megatron left.
So before we end off the video here today, we are going to pick our Thursday night game where we see the Cleveland Browns versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. So obviously, Sterling, you're a Pittsburgh guy. Give me your opinion for this game.
Oh, well, both these teams are coming off a rough week. The Steelers had a tough time against the Patriots. They couldn't really get anything going on offense, especially. They need to make some adjustments if they're going to win some games. And then you got the Browns, who had what everybody thought was going to be an easy game against the Jets and somehow they let the Jets score 2 touchdowns on them within the final 2 minutes, and that goes back to, Stefanski as a head coach. He's shown it before. He's not great at managing the game and making sure his players know what the situations are. For myself, I will never pick the Browns to win over the Steelers. No, even if they had Massage Watson in there, I'm not going to pick them. It's not happening. So I'm picking the Pittsburgh Steelers to win this game on Thursday. Both these teams are desperate for a win. They both have something to prove after weak showings in week 2. And yeah, I'm hoping the Steelers can pull one out.
Yeah, for me, I do look at this game and I go, I'm probably leaning a little bit more towards the Browns in this. I think this is going to be a game of rushing because it just seems like both offenses are going to have to rely heavily on their rushing game. I like Najee Harris, obviously coming off of that ankle injury that he suffered. I have more faith in Nick Chubb, and funny enough, at the moment, I have more faith in the Cleveland Browns offense than I do the Steelers offense. We know the Steelers defense is good, but the Browns defense is also pretty decent. And with how bad the Steelers offense has looked, and I think we can officially say now after 2 weeks, the Steelers offense hasn't they've been bad.
Yeah.
Matt Canada, Mitchell Trubisky, don't know really who's the main issue yet. It's still a little too early to tell, but right now I have more faith in the Browns offense. So we'd like to thank you all for watching today's video. Again, our winners and losers, starting off with our losers. Our number one loser was Kirk Cousins. Then we went to the Raiders. And then obviously the Cincinnati Bengals just not being able to have a win in week 2. And then looking at the winners of the weeks, the Giants, Jalen Hurts, and the Detroit Lions. But yeah, we'd like to thank you all for stopping by. Make sure to hit the subscribe button and hit the bell. It really helps us out. But we will see you all next time.